Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. GV.SC-06, Conducting Due Diligence Before Supplier Partnerships. GV.SC-06 ensures that organizations conduct comprehensive cybersecurity due diligence before engaging in supplier partnerships, evaluating vendor security postures, risk exposure, and compliance adherence from prevent third-party vulnerabilities from impacting the organization. This subcategory belongs to the governed function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that organizations must proactively assess supplier cybersecurity risks before formalizing agreements, ensuring that vendors meet security standards, regulatory requirements, and operational expectations. Without structured due diligence, organizations risk engaging with suppliers that lack adequate security controls, increasing exposure to data breaches, regulatory violations, and operational disruptions caused by third-party cyber threats. By conducting cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships, organizations ensure that vendors align with internal security policies, comply with industry regulations, and demonstrate the ability to manage cybersecurity risks effectively. A structured due diligence process allows organizations to evaluate supplier security capabilities, mitigate potential risks before contracts are finalized, and establish security baselines that vendors must meet to maintain compliance. Organizations that implement pre-contract supplier security assessments, enforce vendor cybersecurity verification processes, and integrate third-party risk evaluations into procurement decision-making improve their ability to prevent supply chain cyber risks before they materialize. Multiple stakeholders play a role in conducting cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships. Procurement and vendor management teams are responsible for initiating supplier evaluations, ensuring cybersecurity assessments are conducted as part of the selection process, and verifying compliance with security policies. Cybersecurity and risk management teams conduct technical security audits, analyze supplier risk exposure, and assess vendor cybersecurity maturity before formalizing contracts. Legal and compliance officers ensure that due diligence aligns with industry regulations, contractual cybersecurity obligations, and data protection laws, reducing legal liability and supply chain compliance risks. Cybersecurity due diligence for supplier partnerships is conducted through structured vendor risk assessment frameworks, continuous security verification processes, and enforcement of supplier security evaluation standards. This includes conducting third-party security audits before onboarding, verifying compliance with regulatory security frameworks, and requiring vendors to demonstrate adherence to cybersecurity best practices before formalizing agreements. Organizations that fail to conduct cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships risk working with vendors that have unknown security weaknesses, failing compliance audits, and increasing the likelihood of supply chain cyber incidents. Several key terms define cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships and its role in supply chain security governance. Third-party risk assessment, TPRA, ensures that organizations evaluate supplier cybersecurity risks before contract finalization, identifying potential vulnerabilities in vendor security practices. Pre-contract cybersecurity audits require vendors to undergo security evaluations, ensuring they meet predefined security standards before engagement. Supplier security verification processes ensure that vendors provide proof of compliance with security policies, regulatory frameworks, and contractual security obligations. Continuous vendor risk monitoring enables organizations to track supplier cybersecurity performance over time, ensuring ongoing security compliance. Regulatory compliance review for suppliers ensures that vendor security due diligence aligns with industry cybersecurity laws, reducing exposure to third-party security violations. Challenges in conducting cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships often lead to incomplete supplier security evaluations, weak enforcement of pre-contract cybersecurity audits, and failure to align vendor due diligence with enterprise risk management strategies. One common issue is lack of standardized vendor security assessment frameworks, where organizations fail to apply consistent cybersecurity due diligence policies across different supplier categories, creating security gaps in supply chain governance. Another issue is over-reliance on vendor-provided security documentation, where organizations accept supplier security claims without independent verification, increasing the risk of undisclosed vulnerabilities. Some organizations mistakenly believe that cybersecurity due diligence is only necessary for high-risk suppliers, without recognizing that all vendors, regardless of criticality, can introduce cybersecurity risks that impact enterprise security resilience. When organizations conduct structured cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships, they improve supply chain security transparency, enhance vendor security compliance, and ensure that third-party cybersecurity risks are mitigated before contracts are finalized. A well-defined supplier security due diligence framework ensures that supplier security requirements are enforced preemptively, vendor compliance verification is standardized, and supplier security assessments align with enterprise risk management strategies. Organizations that implement structured pre-contract cybersecurity assessments, enforce third-party security verification processes, and integrate supplier due diligence into procurement strategies develop a comprehensive supply chain risk management framework that strengthens vendor security oversight and reduces third-party cybersecurity risks proactively. Organizations that fail to conduct cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships face significant security, operational, and compliance risks. Without a structured evaluation process, businesses risk engaging with suppliers that lack adequate security controls, leading to potential data breaches, regulatory fines, and supply chain disruptions caused by cyber incidents. A common issue is relying on supplier-provided security assurances without independent verification, where organizations accept vendor claims about security maturity without conducting their own assessments, increasing the risk of undisclosed vulnerability. Another major challenge is failing to assess supplier cybersecurity readiness before contract finalization, where organizations formalize agreements with vendors before evaluating security risks, leading to compliance failures and unforeseen security gaps. By implementing structured cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships, organizations ensure that vendor security risks are identified, mitigated, and managed proactively. A well-defined supplier evaluation framework helps businesses prevent supply chain security breaches, strengthen third-party security compliance, and ensure that vendors align with corporate cybersecurity governance strategies. Organizations that conduct structured pre-contract security assessments, enforce vendor cybersecurity compliance verification, and integrate third-party risk evaluations into procurement strategies improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate supplier cyber threats efficiently. At the partial tier, organizations lack formal vendor due diligence frameworks, leading to unstructured supplier security evaluations, minimal third-party security compliance enforcement, and weak alignment between supplier cybersecurity risk assessments and enterprise security policies. Vendor security governance is handled reactively, with organizations only identifying supplier security risks after an incident occurs. A small business at this level may onboard cloud service providers, software vendors, or payment processors without evaluating their cybersecurity maturity, increasing exposure to vendor security breaches. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured cybersecurity due diligence policies, ensuring that vendor security risks are partially assessed before partnerships are established. However, supplier due diligence efforts may still be limited, with inconsistent application of pre-contract security assessments across different supplier categories. A mid-sized retail company at this level may require high-risk payment processors to provide security documentation before engagement, but fail to apply the same level of security scrutiny to suppliers handling customer data, creating security gaps in third-party risk management. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured supplier cybersecurity due diligence framework, ensuring that vendor security assessments are standardized, third-party security compliance verification is continuously enforced, and supplier security governance aligns with enterprise cybersecurity risk management strategies. Supplier security governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing supplier security assessments and ensuring that pre-contract security due diligence is embedded into procurement decision-making. A healthcare organization at this stage may require all electronic health record software providers, cloud hosting vendors, and medical device suppliers to complete structured cybersecurity risk assessments before contracts are finalized, ensuring compliance with data protection regulations such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven vendor cybersecurity due diligence platforms, predictive third-party security compliance tracking tools, and automated supplier risk assessment solutions to dynamically enforce pre-contract cybersecurity requirements and ensure real-time vendor security compliance verification. Supplier cybersecurity risk management is fully integrated into enterprise security governance, ensuring that vendor security compliance, supplier risk assessments, and third-party cybersecurity governance remain continuously optimized. A global financial services firm at this level may use AI-powered vendor security risk intelligence platforms to assess supplier cybersecurity readiness, enforce automated security compliance validation, and dynamically adjust supplier cybersecurity requirements based on evolving regulatory frameworks. Conducting cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured vendor security risk assessment frameworks and dynamic third-party cybersecurity compliance enforcement models. One key control is SA-12, Supply Chain Risk Management, which requires organizations to establish formal supplier cybersecurity due diligence processes, ensuring that vendor security risks are evaluated before contract finalization. A multinational technology firm implementing this control may require all third-party software vendors to undergo security risk assessments before integration into enterprise systems, ensuring that supplier cybersecurity vulnerabilities are identified and mitigated proactively. Another key control is CA-3, Information Security Testing and Evaluation, which mandates that organizations conduct security testing on vendors before establishing formal partnerships, ensuring that supplier cybersecurity risks are assessed and managed effectively. A financial institution implementing this control may require cloud-based payment processing providers to complete penetration testing and security validation before contract approval, ensuring that third-party systems do not introduce cybersecurity vulnerabilities into enterprise networks. Conducting cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships also aligns with SR-7 third-party security monitoring, which requires organizations to implement continuous monitoring mechanisms to track supplier cybersecurity compliance and detect security vulnerabilities before they pose risks to business operations. This control ensures that organizations maintain visibility into supplier security performance, allowing them to detect potential threats before they escalate into supply chain-wide security incidents. A global pharmaceutical company implementing this control may establish ongoing vendor security performance evaluations, requiring high-risk suppliers to undergo periodic cybersecurity assessments and audits throughout the duration of the partnership. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic supplier due diligence processes, ensuring that vendors handling sensitive data or IT services complete cybersecurity questionnaires, and provide proof of security compliance before engagement. A large enterprise may deploy AI-driven third-party cybersecurity risk assessment platforms, automated pre-contract security audit solutions, and predictive supplier security risk modeling tools to ensure that supply chain security enforcement dynamically evolves based on emerging cybersecurity threats and vendor risk factors. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as banking, healthcare, and government contracting may require continuous vendor security audits, executive-led supplier cybersecurity risk review meetings, and regulatory-driven third-party security benchmarking to ensure supplier due diligence aligns with legal supplier security mandates. Auditors assess cybersecurity due diligence processes by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced supplier risk assessment frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured vendor security evaluation models, enforce third-party cybersecurity compliance verification, and integrate supplier risk assessments into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance frameworks. If an organization fails to conduct cybersecurity due diligence before supplier partnerships, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in vendor security risk management, weak supplier cybersecurity compliance enforcement, and failure to align third-party security risk assessments with enterprise security policies. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Pre-contract supplier security evaluation reports and structured vendor cybersecurity risk assessment documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured supplier due diligence processes. Third-party security compliance tracking records and vendor cybersecurity audit reports provide insights into whether organizations proactively monitor supplier cybersecurity performance and refine vendor security policies based on real-time security risk intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to supplier security failures and third-party security risk mitigation reports show whether organizations effectively track vendor cybersecurity risks, ensuring that supplier security due diligence remains continuously enforced. A compliance success scenario could involve a global defense contractor that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that supplier cybersecurity due diligence processes are fully integrated into procurement decision-making, ensuring that vendor security risks are evaluated before contracts are finalized, third-party security compliance frameworks are actively enforced, and supplier security governance remains aligned with regulatory security standards. Auditors confirm that third-party security risks are systematically managed, vendor cybersecurity compliance is continuously enforced, and supplier due diligence aligns with enterprise cybersecurity risk governance strategies. In contrast, an organization that fails to conduct structured supplier security due diligence, neglects vendor cybersecurity compliance verification, or lacks formalized supplier security governance models may receive audit findings for poor third-party security oversight, weak supplier security risk management, and failure to integrate vendor supplier security risk assessments into enterprise security strategies. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that cybersecurity due diligence is conducted effectively before supplier partnerships. One major challenge is lack of cybersecurity expertise within procurement teams, where organizations fail to incorporate security risk assessments into vendor selection processes, leading to supplier security evaluations being overlooked. Another challenge is failure to align supplier security due diligence with enterprise risk management objectives, where vendor risk assessments are conducted separately from corporate cybersecurity governance, preventing a unified risk mitigation approach. A final challenge is over-reliance on supplier-provided security documentation, where organizations accept vendor security certifications without independent verification, increasing the risk of unassessed cybersecurity vulnerabilities in third-party networks. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured supplier security due diligence frameworks, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity risk assessments remain continuously enforced, and integrating supplier security compliance verification mechanisms into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance frameworks. Investing in automated vendor supplier security compliance tracking tools, predictive supplier security risk assessment models, and AI-driven supplier security monitoring platforms ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine supplier security due diligence strategies in real time. Standardizing supplier cybersecurity governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that vendor security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to third-party cyber threats and strengthening enterprise-wide supply chain security resilience. By embedding supplier security due diligence into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance vendor security accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable supplier risk management practices across evolving cybersecurity landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.